Right, so this is the second part of modern liberalism, and it's a little explainer again, in hopefully just a few minutes, to see if we can look at these two other features of modern liberalism. So last time, you might remember, we looked at positive liberty, looked at how that was different from negative liberty that classical liberals had talked about, and we looked at the enabling state, the idea that modern liberals think that there's a much bigger role for the state than classical liberals do. Classical liberals think about a minimal state. So this time we're thinking about these two ideas here. Social liberalism and constitutional reform. We'll take those in turn. And I think you can sum it up with this little cartoon. It's a pretty good one. And it uses this idea of affirmative action down here on the right-hand side there. That if someone is less advantaged, if someone has in some way faces some obstacles to being able to compete with other people on an equal footing, then that should be something which the state and society does in order to make it more possible for them to compete equally. And this is at the heart of a liberal idea, which is, of course, about equality of opportunity. While we were talking about this last year, there was a lot of stuff about Oxbridge entrance and the lack of both working class and black and minority ethnic students getting access not just to Oxbridge, but to other Russell Group universities, and whether, in fact, they should do more to positively discriminate, that's another word for affirmative action, or whether the government should step in as well. As it appeared that simply allowing people to compete equally was not achieving the outcome of having genuine equality in those institutions. So this idea of social liberalism then isn't really what we normally think of as social liberalism. We normally think that if you're socially liberal, this must be to do with something to do with the fact that you're tolerant about different people's sexuality or different people's ethnicity or religious beliefs. And that's true, that is about social liberalism. But the reason why it fits into this modern liberal context is because what we're talking about here is tolerance, and the idea that if we're going to employ the idea of equality of opportunity, then the notion that we can allow other people and take account of other minorities and other people in society isn't just enough to see that they exist and let them be. Instead, what we've got to do is make sure that they can compete equally with other people. And I think one good way of looking at this is with this speech by Lyndon Baines Johnson. Lyndon Baines Johnson was the president who took over after Kennedy in the 1960s. And he's the architect. He's mainly remembered these days for terrible things to do with the Vietnam War. But he was really the architect for all of the civil rights legislation of the mid-1960s, and lots of other great big programs called the Great Society, in which he launched a war on poverty. And one of the things he said was that you don't simply take someone out of a cage or out of bondage, as slaves had been before, having hobbled them for hundreds of years, and then put them at a starting line and put them next to somebody who is really quite fit and enabled to take part in the race for life, and then truly believe that you've given that person equality. What you've got to do is not only open the gates of equality, but you've got to be able to ensure that those people can walk through those gates. And that means the state's got to step in and do some things to correct the disadvantages that that free competition have created. So you can see this is a different concept of social liberalism because it respects the fact that there are minorities and there are different sorts of people, but then talks about a greater role for the state. And that's our biggest issue here, that social liberalism is all about having a greater role for the state. Now, Johnson and this next key thinker for us as well, Betty Friedan, were really interested in maximizing liberty. That's what liberalism's about, isn't it? It's about maximizing the potential for individuals to be able to self-realize. And one of the things they were both talking about in their different ways, Betty Friedan articulated this in the context of women and in the context of feminism. She's remembered much more actually as a second wave feminist. And later on, when we talk about feminism after the summer, then we'll return to Betty Friedan as well. But she appears in our specification here as a liberal because she's interested in the way in which individual women ought to be able to realize their potential. But they've got legal equality, political equality, they've got the right to vote, they've got certain legal protections which mean that they are able to have their own property and so on. And yet still in the 1950s and the 1960s, she's looking at American housewives, for example, who are invisible. In a book, she calls her book The Feminine Mystique, because women don't appear and aren't able to actualize themselves, to make themselves present in modern society, which is dominated by men. What then we need is the state to step in and open the door for women, to make it more possible for women to get jobs, make it more possible for women to be able to have their own income, and make it more possible for women to have control of their own reproduction, for example, by making abortion legal and the pill legal. And once the state has stepped in and done those things, i.e. an expanded role for the state, then it'll be possible for women to have more freedom. So this is, again, it's an idea which contests classical liberalism, because it talks about the way in which the state, far from interfering in people's lives and limiting their freedom and being a restraint on people's lives, is actually maximizing the opportunities for people, but in this case, particular groups of people who've previously been disadvantaged. And that's another reason why there are odds often with classical liberals, because classical liberals don't think there's a necessity for that kind of state intervention. We'll say a bit more about Betty Friedan in another video, and we'll do the same about John Rawls as well, because they're important key thinkers for modern liberalism. But let's look at this fourth idea for modern liberalism, the idea of constitutional reform. And here's an area where we see some agreement with classical liberals, but it's very much because it's an extension of the modern liberal idea. Everything we've seen so far for modern liberals is in contrast to classical liberals, because it's about the expansion of the state. He's not one of our key thinkers, but he's a kind of important modern liberal thinker called Hobhouse, says that if you're going to expand the role of the state, then you need that state to be more accountable, to give the people more opportunities to have consent over it. It has to be a better state. The state must be improved. So one of the things that modern liberals are interested in then is not simply having a bigger state, but one which is more liberal in as much as it has these features in it. So modern liberals are interested in a codified constitution. Well, what do you know? So are classical liberals, for example. Modern liberals are interested in devolution, the idea that instead of there being one big central power, power is fragmented. Well, we saw that with classical liberals as well. Modern liberals are interested in the way in which they can become politicians, people who are representatives can be made to be more accountable. We can put checks and balances on politicians from becoming too powerful. We can make them more accountable to each other, by separation of powers, for example, and through elections, but we can make them accountable through things like freedom of speech. So far, actually, this is one of our richest areas in which modern liberals agree with classical liberals. Where we might find a little bit of difference is in the idea that if you're going to have ways in which each of these different groups of people in society can maximize their individual freedom, they must be able to make the government responsive to their needs, and therefore we must extend the franchise to different groups. It's not enough to go back to the 19th century and make sure you've elected some wise and enlightened people who can look after all of our rights. Instead, women must have the vote. People who've been previously excluded as minorities, black people and other people, must have the vote. Increasingly now what we look at is 16 and 17-year-olds must have the vote. Liberal Democrats, for example, are on board with that one as well. Why? Because it's about making the state more accountable and making sure that consent is one of the things which is enhanced to ensure that enabled state, that enabling state, that bigger state doesn't become overpowerful. Okay, so that looks something which we would take as a consensus thing. We all agree, therefore, that we want a better kind of liberal democracy. But one of the things about liberal democracy is that it has some anti-democratic features to it. So one of the things that modern liberals are not keen on is referendums, because referendums are an aggregation of individual people's wants at a particular time. They're easy to manipulate by demagogues, and therefore they don't take account of wider society's happiness or the rights of minorities, and hence, therefore, they're a feature of the tyranny of the majority. So whenever we see these things, tyranny of the majority and referendums, we're often seeing them these days in the hands of people like Viktor Orban in Hungary, for example, who has a constitutional referendum which is designed to give him more power, Or in Turkey, a similar thing happened as well. And in Poland, a similar thing's been done, in which a majority of people have taken part in a referendum in order to take away some people's rights. And some people, of course, might argue that Brexit was something similar to that as well. So where we have representative democracy, it's going to be limited. And this is the anti-democratic feature of it. Representative democracy is limited by codified constitutions, which means that the people at any given time can't simply change the constitution for whatever the majority of people want because it suits their whims or their prejudices at that particular time. And we're also going to have unelected judges. So it's a feature of both the UK system and the US system, most European systems as well, that there is a third power in government, not just the executive, not just the legislature, but a judiciary. And the judiciary is a group of unelected judges who are there to hold to account, but also put a harness around democratically elected governments in order to stop them taking away the rights of minorities, but the rights of other people as well, to stop them from the government becoming too powerful. There's an extra element to this as well. I put this one in here as part of the EU because one of the features of modern liberalism is that if you give the state more power, let's say, for example, not just an individual nation state, but a supranational state, a state which includes more than one country. Think, for example, of something like the EU. We can see what the EU, the more it expands from 6 countries in the 1950s to 28 countries now, soon to be 27, but 28 countries now, the whole project of the European Union from a modern liberal point of view was that as it expanded, it was enhancing the liberty of all the people who were part of it. And the more powerful it became, the more it became possible for it to impose those liberal values on places and countries and regions which previously hadn't had them. So, if you like, there's a kind of aggressive form of modern liberalism here, which is about using the state's power to enhance more people's liberty. Now, for classical liberals, for lots of conservatives as well, that is a complete absurdity. The idea that the EU gives people more power and gives people more consent would be seen to be something which hasn't happened in reality, and that's why people reject it as far in the Brexit referendum. Okay, so that's your last 2 ideas of modern liberalism. That's 4 ideas we've had altogether: enabling state, positive liberty, constitutional reform, and social liberalism. We've looked at 2 other key thinkers here, John Rawls and Betty Friedan. We'll look at those in a little bit more detail in separate videos. But as usual, if you've got any questions about these things and the way we've talked about them, and in particular, the way they're a contrast with classical liberalism, that's where we're heading now, to look at the contrast between classical and modern liberalism, then drop me an email as usual. Okay.